Hello, BookTube, and welcome to Sunday. Some of you will have seen in your subscription feed a recent video by David Murphy, my brother in Bloviation, my tag team member in Tedium. he does a read-along, what he calls a romp, but which never actually is very rompy, through the weekend edition of the Wall Street Journal. And the reason he does that is because he's got a degree in business and finance and whatnot and knows all the arcana. But he comments on the whole thing. And I do the same thing here on this channel. I this spring started walking up the street to get the New York Sunday Times on Sunday morning. I've had to fine-tune the process. The New York Sunday Times is a gigantic wodge of a thing, and it has to be put together by the shop owner every morning. It doesn't get to them that way. It gets them just in a pile, and they have to wrap it. They have to fold it into the incarnation with which that it's familiar to readers, and they need time to do that. They always tell themselves they might do it the night before or something like that, but unless you're an overnight shop, you're going to have to do it before you open in the morning. So I like to give my shop owner a little time to do that. So I don't get there right away, as soon as the shop opens. But you don't want to wait too long either. Not only because there's a chance that it's not a stack of times that they could be sold out. There's nothing more bitter than going to a bodega for something and them not having it, but also because the longer the day goes on, the longer the morning goes on, the more likely the higher the likelihood that you're going to encounter crazy people. And I really like to go through at least one day of the week without encountering any crazy people at all, if I can help it. It's impossible to do if you go out into Boston. If you go out into any city in America, you are going to encounter crazy people. And by that, I don't mean people who are acting a little strange, maybe who are a bit rude, people who eat fast food on the subway or anything like that. I'm talking about clinical, unmedicated crazy people who don't know where they are, people who talk to walls, people who could easily walk into traffic or take a knife to you or something like that. The streets of urban America are absolutely populated with such people. They aren't the exception at all. You can't go a 5-minute walking errand in any direction at any time of the day without encountering them, except if you go early enough in the morning. I went early enough this morning. I got the Sunday Times, had a wonderful chat with the shop owner, got a bunch of other stuff too, and came back here to Hyde Cottage to do my bit for this mind-numbing tedium that David and I have set up. I was forestalled in that aim by a sneezing fit, by an epic sneezing fit that set me back. It ate into the time of day. I sneezed once every 21 seconds for 2 hours and 10 minutes straight. After the first hour, I was semi-delirious. After I passed the second hour mark, a fine spray of blood was coming out with each sneeze. My rib cage felt like somebody had taken a ball-peen hammer to it, and it just wouldn't stop. Once I passed the 2-hour mark of just sitting there on the edge of a chair, just going ta, 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 like clockwork. Once I passed the 2-hour mark, once you pass the 2-hour mark, when that happens, you just assume that's how you're going to die. You're not actually going to die in the siege of Minas Tirith the way you always dreamed. Instead, you're going to die from sneezing. That's what's going to say in the paper. And I didn't obviously die. It did go away. It's left me weak and sore, physically sore, from sneezing that many times in 2 hours and 10 minutes. The main problem was that it cost me those 2 hours and 10 minutes. I couldn't do anything. I couldn't read. I couldn't think. I certainly couldn't write. I couldn't do anything. I had to sit at the edge of a chair and just duh, 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 over and over again. No idea what's blossoming or dying out in the air that caused it, but it set me back on a day when I could scarcely afford to be set back because I had a mountain of work to do. And as a result, probably a beneficial result from your point of view, our tour through the Sunday Times today is going to be fairly abbreviated. I am not going to bloviate for an hour. We're going to do 2 sections. The Sunday Times has many, many sections. There was a whole bunch of great stuff to look through today. The New York Times Magazine, in addition to all of the fluff and whatnot, had a piece of reporting on the steady backstage drama of building towards a war with Iran. that will almost certainly have its authors in contention for the Pulitzer. And that's what I love about both the New York Times, the Sunday New York Times, and the New York Times Magazine, is that you never know when you're going to encounter something like that. It can happen right between listicles about latest fall fashions. And the art section and the leisure section, and there was a special pull-out section on the enduring legacy, the enduring cultural after effects of Giovanni's room. All that was wonderful. If you have a chance to buy the New York Sunday Times on Sunday, you really ought to give it a look-see and see if it appeals to you. But we're not going to talk about any of it because I lost 2 hours today. So we're going to talk about the front section of the paper a bit and then move straight on to the book review. The New York Times Pull-Out Sunday book review is the pinnacle of my profession. It is the place where reviewers go to be seen. It is the place where books go to arrive. And it's at the middle. It's buried in the center of the New York Sunday Times. So I always leave it until then because it's a thrill for me. I mean, it was a thrill for me even when I was just, a general purpose civilian reader. It's even more thrilling for me now that I've got a little bit of skin in the game. I like to see who's reviewing what. I like to know what has jockeyed into position in this limelight place. So we'll do that. But first, we're going to look at the front page of the New York Times, the New York Sunday Times, which we often do. And see what we can make of it. We'll see what we can make of it. We won't really do any jumps to the inside. The only jump to the inside was in the obituary section, and that's a little bit grim. Terrence Dix, who's a name that won't be familiar to most of you. Sue Morrow will probably know his name. He was the creative heart and soul of Doctor Who for a long, long time. He originally started as a freelancer, because they'd been having the early show of Doctor Who on TV had been plagued with scripting problems. People popping in, realizing they weren't going to get paid anything or very little, and popped out again. And he was called in as a freelancer for a 3-week contract. And as he put it, and I'm so glad they quote him in the obituary saying, "And there went the rest of my life." And he introduced a whole bunch of stuff. He was Doctor Who's Dorothy Fontana. Dorothy Fontana, the writer for Star Trek, that pulled together a lot of these disparate freelance ideas and started to make a mythology, a coherent story. He did that for Doctor Who, only over a much longer time. We wouldn't be talking about Time Lords if it weren't for Terrence Dix. He came up with that. He came up with a bunch of other stuff too. And he died, and he had an obituary in the Times, so that was a little sad. Because like so many people, I read so many of his Doctor Who novels. They weren't anything to write home about, but they brought you into the world of Doctor Who for, an hour. But anyway, we're going to look at the front page of the New York Times, and I'm going to move on to the book review, and I'm going to try to control myself. I'm going to try to control my ordinary reactions. I had to control myself. I was watching David's video on the Wall Street Journal. I'll try to remember to leave a link to it down below. And the Wall Street Journal had one of these absolutely, by now, typical, they're actually easily parodied profiles of Trump diehard loyalists, the tiny remnant of people in this country that just think Donald Trump is God Almighty. In fact, literally do. You get 6 of them on a panel for Fox News or whatever, and they will unironically say that they trust him more than they trust Jesus Christ, which to Christians means God. And there was one of those in the weekend edition that David was going through, that where some woman said, I listened to Donald Trump because otherwise I wouldn't know what was going on in the world. He is my source of all information, of all news. And there's no way around that. I don't think that we should be devoting space to these people anymore, but there's no way around it. There is a cult phenomenon that has erupted around this con man that is invulnerable. I once thought not. In 2016, I thought, okay, all right. Some of us have known about Donald Trump for a long time. Horrifying things about him for a long time. Stories about his early marriages, stories about his current marriage that are well known, well grounded in the New York press, that no one has ever read because no one has ever written them. Because if you do, he has a whole floor of lawyers whose job it is to pauperize you, even for telling the truth. He's sued people for trying to collect on debts, on his outstanding debts. That's how much he's weaponized the legal system. So you haven't heard these stories, but those of us who knew those stories in 2016 were saying, okay, America, those of you who voted for this guy, let's wait a bit. He's going to do to you what he has done to everybody who has ever trusted him with anything, and then you'll see. Then you'll change your tune. And quite a few of those Trump voters did change their tune, as we saw in the midterm elections. Quite a few of those Trump voters have changed their tune. They have watched and seen. They're not crazy. They have watched and seen what's going on. My tax bill is objectively much higher. My factory has boarded up and disappeared. My friends overseas laugh at my country. They laugh at my country. I have to look the other way. When I look at the newspaper in the morning, I have to look the other way at newspaper reports of children dying in concentration camps on the southern border, dying in chain link fences, laying on concrete floors. 6-year-olds comforting 3-year-olds they don't know. I have to look at stories like that, obvious human rights violations, and look the other way. I have to look the other way. And on top of all that, as sort of the cherry on top of all this same guy who's doing all that stuff also took my health care away. so that has happened. That has created a groundswell of lots of these former Trump loyalists saying, okay, well, I liked the idea that he wasn't a professional politician. I liked the idea that he wasn't Hillary Clinton. But, okay, I'm not crazy, and I'm able to wake up and see this is kind of a disaster, and I want something else. Even if I have to vote Democratic for it, I want something else. I don't want this anymore. Nevertheless, there is a core of people, of Trump people, who have gone beyond any of those reasons why they might have voted for him in the first place. It has now become a cult to them. These are the people who will have a family gathering to talk about, young Sheila's having an unsuitable boyfriend, and they will go around the table to the uncle and the grandfather and the father and the mother, and then they will, without any irony, say, and what about Donald? What would Donald think of this? Those people are unreclaimable, and they were profiled in the Wall Street Journal. One of them was. I think it's a waste of time when they're profiled in the journal. So we're going to try. We're going to hope. I mean, there's nothing like that in the Times today. Ordinarily, there'll be some sort of unholy convergence between these major newspapers, but not in this case. There is Trump corruption on the front page. The emoluments clause of the U.S. Constitution says that the president is not allowed to benefit financially, personally, while he's president from any kind of dealings, for obvious conflict of interest reasons. The only problem with the emoluments clause is that it's not the emoluments law. It's not a law. And Trump has broken it completely. He lied at first and said that he was putting his businesses in a blind trust that would be administered by his children. Even the children admit that's not true. He conducts business all the time and has been shown lately to direct business to his hotels, even if it's public financed, for Secret Service or his vice president. So there's a small article here by Eric Lipton and Annie Carney about that kind of Trump corruption, and there's also an article about how an MIT official resigned as more details of his connection with Jeffrey Epstein, the late Jeffrey Epstein, came to light. I read the whole article, and I don't know. I think the Times was pulling its punches, probably because they don't have the proof yet. I think there's only one reason why you would resign if you were connected to Jeffrey. Jeffrey Epstein gave a lot of money to a lot of scientists, not just at MIT, but all over the world, and treated them like royalty. And I think this guy's not the only one. I think the only reason why you would resign over such things is if you know the hammer blow that's coming, if you're guilty of something more than just taking money from this monster. And there's also a central article. There's an article about college students outsourcing, about just them going global in cheating on papers. But there's also a central article, absolutely persistent in the left-wing press, about Joe Biden. This one is about his involvement with Robert Bork's nomination for the Supreme Court. But that's only nominally what it's about. What it's about underneath it all is keeping a spotlight on the Democratic frontrunner for the Democratic nomination in 2020. And those articles like that just mystify me now. I never miss a live stream of any Biden event now. And before that, well, I have a long history with Joe Biden. It's even longer than my history with Donald Trump. I have been unimpressed by this guy ever since he's tried to run for president. I was writing editorials about him when most of you hadn't been born yet. And I've looked at his presidential candidacy, and I've thought, I think we can all tell what this is. This is Hillary Clinton 2.0. This is an attempt by a certain chunk of the electorate to have Obama back, to have the days when we had a Nobel Prize winner, when we had someone who could finish the sentence, someone who knew where Alabama was, someone who wasn't mocked on the world stage as our national leader. With Hillary Clinton, the idea of extending that legacy was disastrous. And the Democratic Party didn't see that, or acted like they didn't see it. They thought, this is our front runner, this is clearly a way for Happy Days to stay here, without even registering how seismically disliked she was everywhere. I don't know how you could fail to see that, but nevertheless, they did. And I look at these articles like this. This is fluff. I mean, nobody cares about Joe Biden and Robert Bork. This is meant to keep your attention on Biden as a frontrunner in the Democratic race, and that astonishes me. The idea that the Democratic Party could do the exact same mistake in 2020 that they did in 2016, only changing one name, but otherwise exactly the same, boggles my mind. It just boggles my mind. Joe Biden is not hated the way Hillary Clinton was. And that's totally accurate, because Hillary Clinton was eminently hateable, just eminently hateable. I groaned at the idea of 8 years of Hillary Clinton, and we avoided. The only reason that I'm not happy that we avoided it is because, as I tweeted at the time, you have to keep in mind this is a choice not between the lesser of two evils, but between a lesser evil and the end of the friggin' world. And instead, that's what we got. That's the only reason I'm not crowing. Biden doesn't have that. He's not hateable. But he is an incredibly flawed candidate. As I pointed out the last time I did this, it was 2 weeks ago, because I took a week off to go to Vermont where no news happens. But as I pointed out 2 weeks ago, something that no one could have foreseen is happening to Biden. And you only have to watch a live stream of any of his events to see it. No matter how his campaign is spinning things, and no matter how his Republican enemies are digging the knives in, you only have to look at live stream to judge for yourself. This is a guy who hasn't just lost a step, as we say, about, mental degradation. He is clearly in the grip of what a friend of mine would call a massive cognitive episode. He is an incredibly flawed candidate. Even if he managed to beat Donald Trump in the general election, he would certainly die in office in a year at the most. and for the Democratic candidate platform, the Democratic Party, to look at him and say, well, he's got name recognition, his numbers are really good, we better go with him. When they can watch those events as clearly as I can, and unlike last time, they have a slew of fantastic candidates to choose from instead. Anyway, the main thing of interest on the front page, the main article next to that melodramatic tennis photo, is about Donald Trump. And it's the headline is Trump scraps secret talks with Taliban on peace pact. Camp David summit to end war called off after suicide bombing in Kabul. The article is written by Michael Crowley, Lara Jakes, and Mujib Mashai, and it's about this story that started breaking yesterday about how Donald Trump has petulantly canceled a proposed secret summit that he was going to hold with an Afghan representative, with representatives of the Taliban at Camp David, in an attempt to broker a lasting peace. And the U.S. envoy, who has been working behind the scenes to sort of make something like this happen, is the real deal. He is, unlike most people connected with the Trump administration, not a charlatan, a huckster, and a fool. He's instead a real person who genuinely wants some kind of dialogue to take the place of bloodshed, even if that dialogue has to happen in the age-old sense of compromise, which is nobody gets what they want. He's been working on something like that. But the minute I saw that series of tweets from Donald Trump about how he was canceling this meeting that, unbeknownst to most of the public, had been scheduled to happen at Camp David, I thought a number of things that first of all, he didn't write those tweets. He doesn't know the word unbeknownst. Wouldn't know how to use it, even if he did know it, and would use it wrong. Someone else wrote those tweets, so someone else is involved in this massive lie. But the main thing I knew about those tweets is that they are, in fact, a massive lie. Not just because, as a good rule of thumb, you can just take for granted that any public statement that this administration makes about anything will be a lie, at least in part or in whole, but also because it's the kind of lie that Donald Trump has been telling his whole life. He tells preemptive lies to make himself look good. So I haven't been looking at the news today. I was for 2 hours sneezing, and I was playing with the bean and taking her for beautiful walks. Beautiful day. I also had 2 major reviews to write, and I wrote them back to back. Like to see any other book critic in the country do that, but I wrote them back to back, and that took some time. And also, I like the peace that envelops me when I read the New York Sunday Times. I like the peace of curated news. It's not that you're looking at a bubble. It's not that you're being spoon-fed anything. You still have to think critically about it, but at least it's not the jabber, the constant jabber of social media. So on Sundays, I don't look at the news. I don't look at anything. I don't double check on any of these articles to see what's happened in the 12 hours since they were filed. But I know for sure, I bet my last Boston cream pie that the reason why Donald Trump called off this meeting is because it wasn't going to work. Anyway, I can infer that maybe the problem was the Taliban themselves, who have been on a massive killing spree lately. They don't act like people who are willing to come to any kind of negotiation table. Or it could be the Afghan president, the Afghan representatives they are coming up on an election. It might be that they don't want that some element in the negotiation caused them to pull out. But I guarantee you, the story that will come out in the next day or two is that this meeting was never going to happen anyway. And that Donald Trump was lying about it and saying, no, the Taliban killed a U.S. soldier, so the whole thing is off. I can play hardball, same as anybody. You read it in the books that I didn't write. I'd be willing to bet, which means that this is a lie, and once again a pointless lie. Why do that except for a kind of preening, self-important egotism that's just so nauseating to happen on the national stage like this? These things are too important. Anyway, the article goes on about this projected peace talk at Camp David. It doesn't stress what I think it should, which is the absolute abomination of a U.S. president inviting the Taliban to Camp David on 9/11. Just the absolute abomination of that is a story for another time. But the story here is that Trump announced through a functionary who knows English on Twitter that there was going to be a secret meeting and that I canceled it because the Taliban killed a U.S. soldier. Trump does not care about that U.S. soldier dying. He doesn't care if 100,000 of them did. The first and only thing that he's going to check is whether or not that person voted for him. But he doesn't care about that. That was not his reason, and that is the lie at the heart of this story. Claiming that he did it for that reason when there was really a much more egotistical and shallow and vain reason. Probably, my guess would be, when I start looking at the news tomorrow, I will look for confirmation of this. Probably the reason being that the meeting wasn't going to happen anyway. That some key element had exploded, and he doesn't want to admit that. Wants to seem like the decisive person. So that was frustrating, the front part of the time. But we're done with frustration, because we're going to move right on to the book review. Although the book review does not get us free of frustration, because the front book review, the headline review, is Salman Rushdie. It's Quichotte by Salman Rushdie, which does not deserve a front page New York Sunday Times book review. Review is not that good a book. And to make matters worse, the review is written by Jeanette Winterson, who was on the long list for the Booker with Rushdie, and whose latest book, Frankenstein, was nudged off the shortlist by Rushdie and the other third-rate non-entities who were on the list. So there's conflict all over for her to be writing this review, and it doesn't start off promisingly at all. Mine is a love story, said Quichotte, and love will find a way. That's a quote from the book, and is a very accurate sense of how tired the prose is. But then she goes on, say his name like this, Quichotte. His quest is a long shot, and there's a gun involved. Trigger warning, the gun talks. So this is Jeanette Winterson having fun, but the whole thing seems a little bit just self-congratulatory on all sides for it to be happening. Then there's a full page. These things aren't cheap. There's a full page ad for the Testaments by Margaret Atwood, and there's another full page ad for Education of an Idealist by Samantha Power. That's the full page ads. They aren't cheap. But one of the highlights for me this time around, well, first of all, somebody got in a good shot in the letters page, which is always fun, about Oliver Wendell Holmes by Stephen Budiansky, who's a thing that I reviewed for the Christian Science Monitor. I really liked it. And the reviewer in the Times last week wrote that Budiansky was putting words in Holmes's mouth when Budiansky wrote about Holmes's dislike of academia, of professors. And Budiansky could not let that slide, so he writes, in his review of my biography, Oliver Wendell Holmes, Noah Feldman suggests that I projected onto the justice my own outspoken contempt for academics. But on repeated occasions, Holmes made abundantly clear how unimpressed he was by those in Feldman's line of work. Quote, professors as a class, Holmes remarked, dogmatize on unrealities. He was particularly disdainful of the way law professors rarely had to pay any price for being wrong. Academic life, he admonished Felix Frankfurter, is a withdrawal from the fight in order to utter smart things that cost nothing. That thrashing you hear in the background is the Bean, who has just discovered empty book packages on the floor on a Sunday. But for me, one of the highlights of the issue this time around was the By the Book section, where the Times talks to an author and asks them a preset set of questions about books and reading. And this time the author is Patti Smith, the writer and singer, Patti Smith. And I don't have any feelings about her as a writer one way or another, but her answers were wonderful to some of these questions. I want to read you just a couple of them. Like for instance, when they ask her, describe your ideal reading experience, her answer is immediately recognizable from BookTube. Her answer is immediately recognizable as making her a member of our misfit tribe of weirdos who love books. She writes, I read all the time, anywhere, on my stoop, in a noisy cafe, at night in my tour bus bunk. The external circumstances is not the key. It's the book itself. I'm like Gumby. I enter the world of the book and temporarily live there, shutting out all else. Unless I'm researching, I only finish books I love. I don't date. I can pretty much tell right away if I'm going to commit. There are also books I know I will love someday. For instance, it took me years to tackle The Magic Mountain, but once I did, I was transfixed, wholeheartedly enveloped in the atmosphere of convalescence. If I can't figure out what to read, sometimes I stand before my shelves and feel which book is calling for me. I have a special technique for rereading masterpieces like Frankenstein or The Glass Bead Game. I keep the book by my bed and open it at random and read from there. I do that for a new spot for several nights until I feel I have experienced the book three-dimensionally, cubistically, from several angles. So, well, on the one hand, she's going to please Mark Richardson because she unhesitatingly lists The Glass Bead Game as a classic. And on the other hand, she's nuts. She's cubistically experiencing her book. And yet, how many of us have crazy little rituals just like that? Wonderful. There's another one here. Oh yes, I won't belabor this any longer. They ask her the usual question: if you were organizing a literary dinner party, which three writers, dead or alive, do you invite? Her answer is going to have heads nodding up and down all across BookTube. I could never organize a party. I'd wind up spending half the time hiding in the bathroom. Life's terrible for us introverts. But anyway, let's see what we have here else that's of interest. There's a book by James Poniwozik. We saw it. It's called An Audience of One. It's about Donald Trump's relationship with television and television's relationship with Donald Trump. And I thought the book was really good, much better than I thought it would be. And it's reviewed here by Gary Steingart, who had a promising literary career and has become, almost overnight, a kind of parody of a wordsmith hack. And this review is, at times, very good. It reminds me of my usual anthem about how people who get gigs writing fiction really ought to get gigs writing nonfiction. There's also a very smart review by Julian Lucas, who is a contributing writer for the book review. I don't know his name, or her name. There's a review of two books: The Overthrow by Caleb Crane and The Memory Police by Yoko Ogawa. And the part on Caleb Crane's book is really good, really well done. But let's see. There were quite a few of the reviews in here were books that I thought nothing of, or by reviewers that I thought nothing of. Deborah Lipstadt, who is a reviewer I very much like, a writer I very much like, she reviews that book we saw on this channel, Learning from the Germans. The subtitle being Race and Memory and the Memory of Evil by Susan Neiman. And she does a very good job on it. Then there's a review of that new book that we saw on this channel on the Bering Sea. That's very good. It could have been a lot longer. A lot of these things could have been a lot longer. Then, but quite a few. I'd say probably a quarter of the books in the book review this time around. The books themselves are make-weight things. So the reviews were no. I read them, but they were of very little interest to me. They reviewed that book we saw, First You Write a Sentence, just a guide to how to write good sentences. They actually give it a half-page review. And it shares that page with Shlomo Avineri's entry in the Yale Jewish Live series, his little book on Karl Marx, which David Murphy just reviewed for Open Letters. And I might say, the review here is by James Miller, who teaches at the New School for Social Research. And I have to say, as I could say about a number of people who are finding the opportunity and the time to write for Open Letters Review, David's review is better. No offense to James Miller at all, but David's review of this very book is better. Granted, he has a lot more space, but still. It reminded me to remind you that if you are interested in trying your hand at writing book reviews, in addition to being the sexiest booktuber, I am also an editor. I'm the editor of an online literature journal called Open Letters Review. We run a new review almost every day. It's a good, attractive site. The masthead includes some booktubers that you know, and also some published people that you know. And it's not a bad entry point. It's not a bad place to learn the craft of book reviewing, and maybe add a credit to your list if you already know the craft. But then, anyway, we move on to a roundup of children's books. Bruce Handy does a roundup of children's books. they're all animal related, and they all look really good. But one of them that struck me was he reviews Stormy, the kids' book that I just mentioned a couple of days ago on this channel, by a one-name artist named Gu Jing. And his review of the book is really, really good. It's only about 100 words long, less than that. But I was impressed by how I didn't expect to see it there. You never know. If the Times is anything like the Washington Post or the Boston Globe, they get buried in children's picture books, just buried in them, and cannot possibly swim out from underneath that. So the odds of them picking a book that I really liked are pretty slim, and they did. And then the last thing we'll do here is the short list at the end here, where the Times will assemble a group of books on one particular subject. In this case, it's the CIA, and one of the ones that they mention is Surprise, Kill, Vanish by Annie Jacobson, which I thought was really good. The subtitle is The Secret History of CIA's Paramilitary Armies, Operators, and Assassins. A very good book. I think my advanced copy and my finished copy are both gone, but I look forward to the paperback. That's a paperback I'll keep. So there you go. That was our New York Sunday Times. A front page full of alarming stories and outright lies, and a book review section that was fairly strong. So I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back to full bloviating next time. I'm just assuming that next Sunday I will not lose 2 solid hours to something as dumb as sneezing. So I'll be back to full form then. So I'll see you soon. Thank you, BookTube.